happened. He had been married. Things hadn't worked out right in his family. And all of a sudden, they got one of those horrific phone calls. And the news to them was sad indeed. Their son had been arrested. You see, he had killed the ex-wife. The next days and months were awful as they went through the trial, as they tried to figure out why it was that this brilliant, bright son that they loved so much had committed this horrendous crime. They couldn't understand it. They wept tears of agony. Why, God? Why our son? Why did this have to happen like this? Why did this tragedy have to happen to us? She tells the story. It's written in a book called When I Laid My Isaac Down. And in that story, she tells us how it was that she began to pray and think about what God was asking her to do. He was asking her to take this unspeakable tragedy that had happened to her and her husband and to lay it at His feet. Why, God? How? How am I going to surrender this? How are you ever going to bring good out of a life sentence without the possibility of parole? Well, we don't all have such dramatic stories to tell. Yours and my stories pale in comparison to a dramatic story like that. But for me, God came to me and asked me to lay aside something that I dearly loved. He asked me to lay aside my love for music and my love for directing the choir, and I knew that it eventually would be an impact too. And I know the struggle that I felt. Why, God? I like ministry like this. Why, God? I know how to do this. This is what I'm comfortable doing. But God seemed to point out to me that He wanted to take me to a different level, and He wasn't going to be able to do it unless I could come to that place of surrender to Him and His will. All those moments, you've had them. Moments when God spoke to you about that very thing in your heart that was so important. And He asked you to surrender to Him. The struggle is intense. It's a real, it's a genuine, it's a hard struggle. And it takes place deep within our hearts. How do we do it? How do we surrender that thing that is so very important to us? Well, the story that we've been talking about this morning is found in Genesis chapter 22. It's an old story. You've heard it preached many, many times. I'm telling it today from a little bit point of view, trying to understand what Abraham must have felt in those days. And I want to take you back now to that story. If you want to look in your Bibles, you can follow along. We're reading between the lines this morning. Those 3 days had been so very intense for Abraham. Every moment that he spent with his son tore at his heart. Each step that they took in the journey drew them closer to the spot where he knew that he would have to lay down his son on that altar. He remembered that promise. God had given him that promise. It was a promise that He was going to multiply Abraham's descendants, and it would be through his son, Isaac. Day by day, moment by moment, step by step, they journeyed on. Finally, they looked off in the distance, and Abraham could see the mountain that God had called him to. It was the spot where he was to sacrifice his son. When they got close, he spoke to his servants, and he told them to wait. He knew they weren't going to understand what was happening. So they waited. And he took the wood, and he gathered up the fire starter that he always carried with him. He gave the wood to Isaac, and they set out on the journey, still a little ways away, to get to the place where he would sacrifice his son. Isaac was a pretty smart kid. Kids can figure things out pretty fast, you know. I see the wood, he thinks. I see the fire. I've seen sacrifices before. There's something missing here. There's a lamb missing. I don't know what Isaac was thinking. I don't know if he had begun to sense that maybe he was going to be the lamb that was slain that day. I don't know what he was thinking. But he asked his father those questions. Somehow God had given Abraham a sense of peace, enough that through the tears, through the heartache, through the struggle, he could tell his son that God would provide the land for the offering. They reached the place, finally, that God had told them about. Oh, Abraham had cried many tears through the last 3 days. There had been an intense, mighty struggle with God. But somehow, in this quiet sanctuary there on that mountain, the place that God had provided, Abraham felt a peace. A peace that enabled him to do what God had called him to do. He didn't know how it was going to happen. He didn't know how God would multiply his descendants through his son if he actually had to slay him there. But he knew that God would do it somehow. And he trusted God. Oh, just because you trust God doesn't mean your emotions don't scream a little bit. Tell me that as Abraham bound up his son and he placed him in that altar, tell me that his emotions weren't screaming that day. Yes, he trusted. He had a faith that somehow God was going to take care of it all. But his emotions were screaming. He bound his son and he placed him on that altar. He knew that this must happen quickly before he faltered in his faith. If he waited long, he knew that he would grab his son and hold him close to his heart, and off they would go, and he would leave that place of sacrifice. But he trusted. He trusted. And he laid his son upon that altar, and he took the next step, the step of faith. He grabbed the knife that he'd been carrying all that night. He'd seen what it had done. It was an awful instrument used to kill animals, to sacrifice. As he took that hand, tears flooded over his soul that day. His eyes were blinded by those tears, and he raised it, ready in faith to do what God had called him to do. And you know, at that moment, God spoke again. This time it wasn't terror. This time it wasn't laughter. It was joy. Because God said, don't lay a hand on your son. I have provided a lamb for you. And through those tears, Abraham looked out, and there, sure enough, nearby, was a ram caught in a thicket, caught by its horns. And Abraham ran to that ram, and he slayed him, took his son off the altar, and slayed the lamb that God had provided. God will provide. God will do it if we trust him. That moment when he had the knife raised, he was saying, Lord, I trust you. Lord, I really do trust you. But God, this is hard. That moment when Jesus prayed in the garden, he knew that he must offer himself as the sacrifice for all of mankind, was a moment of deep, intense struggle. Oh, he trusted God. Oh, he knew that God would provide. But he still had to come to that moment of complete surrender to God, to lay his life down on that altar for you and for I. Aren't you thankful for that moment? Just as the knife was lifted, God spoke. Just as that time comes in our life, God will speak to us. Now, there have been other trials and testings in Abraham's life, but this one was different. Some of them were born of his own failings. You've read the stories. How Abraham lied and twisted the truth to save his own neck. Some of them were born of his own natural desires. There were temptations, and we all have those. They're born out of our feelings or out of our own desires, our natural desires. But this one was different. This was a test from God. God wanted to know if Abraham would be willing to give him the very most important part of his life. Abraham,